In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, we will begin now this session, which is about the relations with international powers, GCC relations with international powers. I am taking the place for Mr. Abdullah Hajjaj, who could not come by himself. In this session, we have 4 papers that were prepared to deal with this topic about the relationship with international powers with the GCC countries. The first paper will be delivered by Mr. Abdullah al-Shayji, which will be a new approach to GCC-American relations, a future vision. Dr. al-Shayji is a dear friend of mine. He's professor of international relations, University of Kuwait, and a visiting professor in George Washington University, United States. He was the head of Department of Political Science, University of Kuwait, and has obtained the award of University of Kuwait for his work in social and political activities, and has a PhD in political science from Texas Boston University. I give him 15 minutes. Mike, please, Mike. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. It's my pleasure to be taking part in this session with dear colleagues, and I thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for inviting me and also for organizing this important conference, which comes at a time that we are witnessing so many important events such as the summit, the GCC summit in 2 days' time here in Doha, and also other conferences, whether the Manama dialogue that began yesterday in Manama, or after tomorrow there will be also a conference of the Emirates Center for Research in Abu Dhabi. My paper is based on about the effects of transformation. I have just come back from Washington after spending a month and a half there. And it seems that there is that Washington is not happy with the role of the GCC countries, and that Washington is not focusing or not appreciating Mr. Obama's administration is not, and that might be the policy of other administrations, not appreciating the role played by GCC countries. Also, the GCC countries have some concern about how the USA looks upon the issues of the region, especially Mr. Obama's administration, which seems is having a setback in so many issues, not only the Gulf level, but also on the international level. We see that how the enemies of America are using so many lacunes or gaps in the American strategy to benefit from this American setback, and see how that the Russian bear is challenging USA in Crimea and in Ukraine, and how is dealing with the so-called dangers of terrorism, which America has limited to ISIL, without giving heed to the reasons and roots of the emergence of ISIL. So the USA is only dealing with the phenomena, not its roots. There are so many transformations and changes in the American strategy, and there are also a lot of changes in the regional international variables since the beginning of the Kuwait summit, the Gulf summit in Kuwait a year ago. A lot had happened since then, and many things changed, and the prices of oil have gone down for 40%, and this is a very big burden and danger for the producing countries, and very much useful for the importing countries, especially USA. This change, I think, is that USA is now, since last summer, is now the first producing countries of oil in the world, after increasing its introduction to 10 billion 10 million barrels per day, and this, of course, affects the relationship between USA and the Gulf states. And so the price went at 40%, and the emergence of the Khilafat, the state of the ISIL, the American-Iranian differences are getting deeper, and the extension of the negotiations to next July. And it is clear, although both sides denied that, the Americans and the Iranians, but it seems there is a coordination between them about confronting ISL, and the nuclear negotiations are not only on nuclear issues, but they have political aspects also. The John Kerry met his met Zarif more than 10 times last year, and they definitely discussed issues such as Iraq, Syria, ISL, and other issues. And Obama sent a fourth letter to the Supreme Guide of Iran in October, in which he underlined something very dangerous for us in the Gulf, that there are common interests between the two countries, or shared interest, as he called it. And he encouraged him to work to reach a nuclear deal so that Iran can play a role in confronting and fighting ISL, and this is what Iran is doing actually today. And also he stressed that USA is not back to the region to target or to weaken Iran or to weaken its allies, nor to occupy Iraq again. So how in the GCC countries, how would we see this message, this important fourth letter sent by Obama since he came to power in 2009 and to the Supreme Guide, and how could this understanding be made between the axis of evil as described by Bush in 2000, describing Iran, North Korea, and Iraq, and so it can have a deal with the greater Satan, and how that Iran changed from its doctrine and its principle from the Hussein rejectal policies to al-Hassan policy of negotiating and compromising. But before that, I'd like to focus on some important points. The GCC countries, after the reconciliation that took place just before the summit, are still what we call we are still in the Gulf, what we call the Gulf era. That's to say, the Gulf stage in the Arab world. Some people might disagree with this, that we are leading the Arabs nowadays, but I have written that GCC countries, since the Arab Spring and even from that, are the real leaders of the Arab order, or the Arabic order or region, because now it seems that the periphery have become the heart and the heart have become the periphery, and so consequently the United States is very much aware of that Egypt, Iraq, and Syria are no longer strong, but have a big role, but it is the GCC countries that have the role. But unfortunately, there were 8 months of difficult relations in the GCC countries between themselves. But after then, at the end of the day, this was overcome and reconciliation took place. And this, of course, has constitutes important lessons for all. We live in a dangerous situation in an Arab and regional, in an Arab region that has an order system. In order that has the soft power of the GCC countries and the incapability of the GCC countries to constitute sort of collective security. Since the Saudi monarch had launched his initiative to change from cooperation to union, we didn't see any effects to this call. In fact, we will now just want to go back to the cooperation period, and we have forgotten all about a union that was a priority just a year ago. I stress here that there's a sort of Cold War that's taking place between the GCC countries led by Saudi Arabia and Iran on the other side. This Cold War, Iran is launching some reassuring statements, but we judge Iran by its action, not by its words. And we see that the Arab regimes have weakened to such a way that the important role is now for the non-state actors. Obama said that, and his advisors, Rice and Rice, said that this is something that the president will no longer leave any issue in the Middle East or the peace process or the nuclear issue of Iran. That though in September he said that priority in the Middle East is to strike a permanent and durable settlement based on the two-state solution. But we find that nothing has been achieved, and nothing achieved that will leave a good legacy of Obama when he leaves. So we see that the only thing after extension of negotiations with Iran, the only thing that he wants to leave as a legacy is a good deal with Iran on the nuclear issue as an important achievement. Of course, as for the soft threats, I talked about the demographic factor, but as we have very short time, I cannot speak of all the points. Nevertheless, I must say that there are deep differences between GCC countries, despite the fact that USA, and despite what was called in March 2012, the GCC Strategic Forum. This was a very important thing. Since the creation of the GCC countries and up to 2012, there was dealing with the GCC countries individually and bilaterally, and with each country of the GCC would never dealt with us, neither the European Union, nor the NATO, nor the United States, dealt with us as a one block of Gulf countries. No, they always dealt with us on bilateral basis. This was the first time that they spoke of US GCC Strategic Forum, and which was developed by Chaketa and the Manama Dialogue into an integration and including the ministers of defense and not only ministers of foreign affairs. And last May there was a meeting for the ministers of defense of the GCC countries, and that was a big achievement. And now the USA is preparing for the integration, the military defense unified in the defense system for the GCC countries. And there's also a problem how the USA deals with the non-state players. For example, its relations with ISIL. The American strategy, I am strange that there's no seminar made about how to deal and confront ISIL and Islamic extremism, only the focus only on the Sunni extremism, and nothing is said or no conference held about Shiite extremism as we see in Yemen and elsewhere. So I see that 60 countries are going into alliance to fight a non-state organization. So the first time in history, the 60 strongest countries in the world, including NATO, Europe, America, USA, Australia, and all come together to face one organization, which is a non-state organization. And this, of course, represents an important thing and requires a lot of time that I don't have. And there's the Syria and the regime and their position, and there's a lot of differences between the GCC countries and the USA about dealing with the regime of Syria. And the Iranians were given a sort of barter deal. What do you want as a change? Bashar Assad without chemical weapons or the extremists. So Washington Post yesterday said that the extremist groups will share Syria with the Syrian regime. So what is our position and what is Turkey's position? And Iran, it's clear that is joining them and was a partner who has not been officially announced. And the USA did say and did confirm that Iranian F-14 did fight and bombard areas in Iraq. They recognized that 2 days ago, and today said, no, we didn't do it. So this is a very complex issue, and but there was American-Iranian coordination to get rid of al-Maliki. As they brought him to power by a deal, they also put him aside by another deal. And you must not believe that there is no coordination between Iran and USA. No, there's a very high-level coordination between them. Iran is very important for Iran, and the negotiations on nuclear weapons is very important for us, because not only the nuclear issue, Iran wants to be respected, taken into consideration as an important player And notice here that the United States has never qualified any organization that is in favor of Iran as a as a terrorist organization. And then we have this fossil petrol, which is very much getting higher and higher in the USA, and which is strategically very important. This means that USA will be the first gas producing in the world and the first oil producing country in the world. And this is a very important development that changes the situation in favor of USA. But USA will not withdraw from the region even if it does not import 1 barrel of petroleum from it. Because it does not want the enemies or its competitors come to the region. The last minute I would like just say that my conclusion is that the GCC countries are now are being more robust, and they have showing more robustness. That's to say, the USA in Obama's era and whoever comes from will be hands off more than the past. And the GCC countries know that there is no strategic alternative or substitute that can play the role of protection and security other than the USA. That's why in the next 10 years, we will not see an Indian or Chinese or Russian fleet that come through the Hormuz Strait. That's why the relationship will be on a strategic level as usual, but GCC can be more equal in their dealing with the USA. The Americans are not happy with the GCC countries, as an American official told me, that when we deal with a strong power, they deliver, referring to Iran, that they deliver. While as the GCC countries don't seem to be strong and coherent. That was with the reconciliation. Now, after reconciliation, I hope that we can send a message to Washington that then we speak of the GCC, what the GCC are talking about. There were three GCCs. There are Qatar by itself, and there were 3 countries that were in difference with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Bahrain. There was Kuwait and Oman. So there were 3 Gulf state points of view. Now we hope that there's one point of view, and that's why we will be a strong bloc to deal with. But Iran is pragmatic. Iran, during Khomeini, dealt with USA twice. First time in the deal of releasing the American hostages from the embassy of Iran, Tehran, on the 20th of January 1981, when Reagan was taking the oath, and then the Iran-Contra, when USA provided the weapons to Iran through Israel to provide arms to the Contras in Nicaragua. And now the deal is also there between Iran and USA, and the Supreme Court said that this is great flexibility on the side of Iran. So there must be a strong, coherent GCC countries position. We must go back to the King Abdullah's initiative so that we move from cooperation to a union, not a GCC Cooperation Council, but a union council. The situation in the region is changing. There are non-state actors in the region, the Houthis in Yemen, and ISL in Iraq and Syria. If we are not coherent, if we are not unified, United States will not deal with us as equal partners. So we must invest in this moment of strength of GCC countries. We must invest in the soft power and the hard power of USA, and we must also, and this is my opinion, maybe some people disagree with me, that we must have P plus P5 plus 1 plus 1. The GCC countries must have a role in the ongoing negotiations between Iran and P plus 1. Iran is not happy with that. USA is hesitant because we have discovered that we were fooled because there were secret negotiations taking place in one of our allied countries, a member of GCC, which is Oman. For 7 months there were the secret negotiations, and we were not notified of that. And now, despite the fact that GCC countries are involved in airstrikes of the coalition, US Obama sends a letter to the Supreme Guard saying that we have shared interests. So if we do not respect ourselves, the Americans will not respect us.
Thank you very much. America is stepping backwards. The GCC, we hope the GCC will step forward, make sure that we have the potentials to shift the balance of power in the region if we have the political will to do so. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah al-Shayji, for his fruitful presentation, which really highlighted significant issues to find a new approach of the GCC-US relations. The second presentation is titled the US decline and the global disturbance with the Middle East factor. Stephen Hawke will address us, the professor of political science of Kent, University of Britain. He has he authored many articles on the U.S. Power. He also co-authored the U.S. foreign policy since World War II and the national interest and foreign aids, and he is a former head of the foreign policies department of the Faculty of Political Sciences. I grant him 15 minutes. Now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Shukran. Thank you to Dr. Marwan Kabalan, Zahir Hamadi, and other people who have organized this wonderful conference. I'm always a bit nervous discussing U.S. foreign policy to foreign groups. It seems that everyone, to some extent, everyone is an expert on U.S. foreign policy, and I hope that I can provide some information that sheds light on the state of the balance of power, the role of the United States, and U.S. relations with the Middle East and the GCC in particular. This is always a very controversial subject. U.S. foreign policy is notorious for its controversy, which has much to do with the fact that the United States is a rather pervasive power throughout the world. But in my view, it's very important for world politics, for the United States, and for the GCC to maintain this relationship within this region. As you know, the United States faces many challenges to its world power. Many of these problems are, in my view, self-inflicted and internal to the United States. There are multiple crises at once facing the United States. There are economic crises having to do with the U.S. budget, U.S. deficits, trade deficits, global debt. There are political struggles having to do with domestic politics, basically the stalemate between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Very little is getting done in Washington right now. Security crisis having to do with the U.S. involvement in the U.S. involvement in Iraq, Afghanistan, so many conflicts throughout the world. The U.S. Defense Department is rather exhausted at this time. Many troops, most of the troops have come home. They have filled up the Veterans Affairs hospitals. There's very little appetite in the United States for continued military, large-scale military efforts. And there's a legitimacy crisis in the United States having to do with the nature of the Iraq War, the roots of the Iraq War, 2003, U.S. espionage, spying on not only our adversaries, but many of our closest allies, and quite a bit of espionage, domestic espionage, spying on, or just gathering information on all of American, U.S. American citizens through the internet communications. So there are all these domestic and international crises facing the United States at the same time. And if you look at the graphic up there on the screen, you will see that according to even the U.S. National Intelligence Council, part of the CIA, which projects that China will catch up with the United States in a variety of power indicators by roughly the year 2040, 2042. We're all familiar with some of these statistics. It does appear that the unipolar balance of power will give way in the foreseeable future to a multipolar world. Frankly, I think a lot of people would welcome that, and I think the United States, to some extent, would benefit by having more support and having more allies that could step up and help resolve some of the shortcomings and the limitations of U.S. foreign policy. But we've seen that this relative decline, not decline per se on an absolute level, but relative to other powers, the unipolar world is giving way to a multipolar world, and the problem here is that the perception of U.S. decline, allows other powers to exploit the perceived decline of the United States. There's an old expression that nature abhors, or nature dislikes, a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody must fill that vacuum, and we've seen already some actions, some power plays by the Russian government and the Chinese government in different respects to sort of take advantage of what is seen as a decline of the United States and weakness of the United States. But still, the United States has the largest economy in the world, as you know. Some of the GNP in 2013 was in the area of $18 trillion. Even if you have a somewhat generous interpretation of the Chinese currency, the United States is still quite ahead of China in terms of overall output, and certainly in terms of technological development, telecommunications, high-tech. The United States is very much ahead of the game. The United States continues to have the largest military infrastructure. The United States is responsible for something like 40% of global military spending, and that is not including the military spending from the NATO allies and from allies in East Asia and in the Middle East. So a lot of that power from our allies reinforces U.S. military strength. And so in that respect also, the United States is still quite powerful in the world. Now, the GCC countries are more vital than ever, given the shared interest in regional stability, given the shared interests in combating Islamist terrorism, jihadism. The United States supports and gets a great deal of support back from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, other regional powers, and I think that this is something that will continue. There's a high level of interdependence between the United States and its allies in this region, and so I think that's important, and also the United States is working with our allies here to resist, obviously, the Iranian development of a nuclear weapon, Iranian aggressive actions in the Middle East. So there are lots of areas of common interests between the United States and the GCC region, and I actually believe that this is going to be even a more vigorous and a more important relationship as time goes on. Let me speak briefly about U.S. foreign policy, specifically the Obama administration. You might call it the Obama doctrine, as it has been explored or has been articulated by President Obama. And the strategic goal here is for the United States to maintain its primacy in the world, to maintain its world power, but with greater support from allies in all regions of the world, and to have our allies take a more active role in supporting these common interests. You may have heard the expression that the U.S. is not very interested now in sending more boots on the ground to the Middle East, especially in the form of conventional large-scale mobilizations. We saw what happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the difficulties the United States has had. And so President Obama has made it clear that with ISIS and with other regional problems, that the United States will support efforts through counterterrorism efforts rather than counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency meaning, trying to win the minds and hearts of our shall we say, partners in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to gain the support of the masses in those countries. The United States doesn't do a very good job of counterinsurgency. We saw that in Vietnam. We've seen that in other places. So the Obama administration has moved away from counterinsurgency towards what's called counterterrorism, specifically having to do with sharing intelligence, U.S. air support, the use of drones, and training military armies that support the United States in the Middle East and in other places, and really to use U.S. technology and U.S. Diplomatic efforts and whatever military cooperation efforts to maintain U.S. presence, to maintain U.S. involvement, but without large-scale boots on the ground. Of course, this is something that most people in the Middle East would welcome. The United States is known as to being somewhat can be somewhat of an imperialist power, a hegemonic power. And so for the United States to draw back and expect more cooperation from its allies and the sharing of intelligence, the sharing of technology, the sharing of diplomatic initiatives is something that I think is unique to the Obama administration. We've heard President Obama talk about nation building. In this sense, nation building should be nation building at home rather than overseas. We have a lot of domestic problems in the United States, as I've mentioned, and so in a sense, to strengthen the U.S. economy, to strengthen the social bond, the social capital within the United States, can be a source of U.S. power. We know that President Obama has a bit of an idealist streak. He was the one who said that he will talk with anybody, but he will not be able to communicate those who have a clenched fist, and this was in regard to Iran. We've seen this so-called engagement policy attempted by the Obama administration to try to make connections, to develop somewhat of a dialogue with the Iranian government, and we've seen in terms of the nuclear talks that that has not amounted to very much. There has not been an agreement, and this bit of idealistic notion that just simply by talking to a foreign government is going to lead to cooperation is somewhat of a dream of the Obama administration. So that brings me to my concluding remark which has to do with domestic politics at home in the United States. As you may have picked up from the press, President Obama is not very popular in the United States among the citizens. His approval rating is around 42%. But he's also very unpopular on Capitol Hill. The Congress, you may have been keeping track, maybe not, but in recent legislative elections, the Republican Party has taken control over the House of Representatives and the Senate. So now there's really no basis for support within Congress, and especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. security policy. Senators like Senator John McCain and Lindsey Graham have been arguing for a much more hawkish foreign policy, a much more forceful policy, and they would like to see actually a return to boots on the ground in many theaters of conflict in the Middle East. President Obama is also not very popular within the defense establishment. He's now into his fourth Secretary of Defense. He does not seem to be very interested in having a dialogue with senior military advisors. He's much more comfortable getting his advice from the National Security Council and at times from the State Department, but he seems uncomfortable working with the military, and that has led to all of the problems we've seen inside Washington. The 2018 presidential elections, 2016 elections, I should say. It's likely that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee. We have no idea what Republican candidate will step forward, but whoever the next candidate for president is going to be, they will be pushing for a more hawkish foreign policy, a more forceful foreign policy, and to sort of compensate or to make up for the perceived weakness, not of the United States so much, but weakness of the Obama administration in its foreign policy. Finally, then, from my standpoint, it seems like this continued partnership with the GCC is going to be vital, even more vital than in the past. The region, the GCC region, is very interdependent with the United States. There are mutual gains to be had through continued defense cooperation, and I look forward to following that relationship between the United States and the GCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hook, for this enlightening.
شكرا دكتور هوك على هذه المحاضرة الجيدة. In fact, they have spoken about the different factors of strength that are the real factors of change in the international arena. But if we now scrutinize this in light of the setback or the decrease of the role of the United States in the international arena, can be re-examined. The third intervention will be by Dr. Bichara Khader under the title of the EU and GCC distant neighbors, close partners. Dr. Fakhri used to work in Belgium, and he is member of the advisors of foreign affairs in the European Commission and member of the elderly group in the Mediterranean and the European presidency, and he is a visiting professor in many universities in Europe and Arab countries, and he has more than 28 publications about the Arab foreign relations and the GCC countries and North America. Dear friends, I sent a long paper to the organizers about the relationship between Europe and the GCC countries. I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this paper that will be distributed to you later on. I can summarize my paper saying that the relationship between Europe and the GCC countries is limited and has strategic neglect, and this is for several reasons. The different natures of the two organizations and the reservations made by some European countries to move a Europeanized Europeanize its relations with the GCC countries in such a way that the bilateral relations are focused on between the different GCC countries, and the European Union does not want to, and the GCC countries don't want to raise the anger or hostility of the United States, and the European Union also cannot work collectively or in a unified way and don't have a security or foreign policy in the GCC countries that is unified. First of all, I will speak about the historical aspects of the relations between Europe and GCC countries, and then we will discuss the new pathway for developing this relationship. The European Gulf relations went in several stages. The one from 1973 to 1980, which was characterized by the so-called dialogue, Arab-European dialogue that began after the oil crisis, and the Gulf countries participated in this dialogue to strike a unified European policy regarding the Palestinian issue, which was the main and central issue for the Arabs at the time, and that was ended by the Venice Declaration in 1880. On a personal note, I participated in the cultural committees of that dialogue, while my friend, my brother Naim Khader, was the one who is in charge of this dialogue, and his punishment was that he was assassinated in Belgium in the 1st of June of 1980. This was to punish him because he succeeded in penetrating the silence wall of Europe to make Europe hear the Palestinian voice. The second stage began in the 80s, and it witnessed important developments in the prices of oil. It came down from 81 to 40, and the geopolitical developments that were very dangerous. Egypt was kicked out of the Arab Common Action after the Camp David agreement, and that, of course, disturbed the whole Arab order, and then there was the revolution in Iran, and the revolution was threatening the neighboring countries. These developments revealed the security weakness of the GCC countries who created the GCC Council in 1980, while the European Arab dialogue was frozen because of the Egyptian policies and because the Arab countries were too busy in the Iran-Iraq war. At that time, 70% of the European exports were to Arab countries, and this, of course, gave the Gulf area a particular importance, and the feeling in Europe that it was time to sign an economic agreement with the GCC countries without provoking United States, which was providing security and protection to the whole region. After many consultations and many preparations, an agreement of cooperation between the European Union and the GCC countries was signed, and they decided that there will be a joint council that meets every year to follow up all the free zone agreement and other agreements. And that was important for GCC countries because it gave them some privileges to go into the common market of Europe, and whereas the European Union wanted to make sure that its petroleum provisions are guaranteed. Both sides achieved their goals, and this was at a stage when the Cold War was still at its highest levels, and China was isolated from the world. But after that, and after more than 23 joint councils and meetings, the two parties could not sign an agreement of free trade between them for several reasons that are discussed in my paper, such as the petrochemical exports and the carbon tax and the issues of human rights and the taxes on the exports of the GCC countries. And so, in brief, the dialogue was focused on sectarian differences and conflicts, and usually the Europeans say that the GCC countries are responsible of that because they were not willing opening the doors for the European investments in the petroleum sector, but the GCC countries said that they were convinced that the Europeans every time raises a new issue to cover for its lack of enthusiasm to sign this free trade agreement. So we feel that they are the lobbies who are against this agreement. All this hesitation was the result of the absence of a European strategic vision on how to deal with the Gulf city countries in the following way. First of all, the commerce of Europe with the GCC countries is $130 to $145 billion, which represents half of the European Arab trade. The GCC is the only Arab organization that is functioning, although slowly, as many colleagues said today, compared to the Union of the Maghreb, which was created in 1983. And the GCC countries have always been a reliable ally of the West and a stable partner. For a lot of the sovereign funds of the GCC countries are in Europe, and there was agreement between Europe and GCC countries about a lot of regional and international issues. Six, there is a tendency in the Gulf to diversify their alliances and not to put their security in the hands of USA alone, especially that USA is a source of worry and concern for the GCC countries because of the US position regarding Israel. Despite all that, the relationship between Europe and the Gulf states are not on the strategic level on the long term. I give several reasons for that. First of all, the foreign policy of Europe is based on short-term reactions. Some European countries, such as France and Britain, prefer to have bilateral relations with the GCC countries other than to have it as a block of countries. Third, the prosperity of the GCC countries does not enable Europe to use the same tools that it used in its Mediterranean policies or its relations with the Maghreb countries within the Euro-Mediterranean partnership or the unity for the Mediterranean. I say this, I refer here to the financial aid or the facility of circulation of people. So the nature of this the GCC country is that the European Union is one market, one currency, and the circulation of people and goods is guaranteed. And knowing that there are 28 European countries that speak 24 different languages, and the cost of translation in the European Union is about $1 billion to $1.2 billion dollars or euros, which represent a big share of the European budget, which is $120 billion this year. This has stopped any possibility of a strategic partnership between the GCC countries and the Europeans, and this had led the European Parliament that wants a good long-term relationship with the Gulf and call for it. No doubt, after the Arab Spring, the European would be aware of the fact that the GCC countries can, if they've ended their differences, can play a diplomatic and economic role that is very important in the Middle East and North America, and fill the vacuum left by these other countries, either for domestic conflicts or because of sectarian policies. Europe must be aware that the GCC countries can play a very important role on the level of investments in the Mediterranean countries and the Maghreb countries, and consequently, the Mediterranean policy cannot neglect this role. That's why my last advice here, and this is my last words, that they should be aware that the GCC countries are not only a market of oil, but they are nations that want to develop and look forward to civilization and cooperation on equal terms. And I am surprised that mostly that I see that the European media attacks on the GCC countries and their leaders at the time that European countries are competing for its monies and its petrol. So that's why the image of GCC countries should be improved in the European countries, and this is something very important, as many others said, but this cannot be done if we don't see a good, transparent economic performance inside the GCC countries, and a culture of creativity and knowledge, and a tendency to confirm identity and belonging, because an identity is a bridge that brings people together. Thank you.
Thank you for Dr. Khader. We were really impressed by his presentation, which shed light on what really gives rise to many concerns amongst us as Arabs and then as partners with the EU. And thank him again for discounting 2 minutes of our time. And I move on to the last speaker, who will present his paper on the Silk Road and the Chinese GCC pattern, Dr. Ma Lirong. And due to her commitment abroad, one of her students, Dr. Shang, will present it on her behalf. She is the Deputy President of Middle East Institute and also Deputy Editor of the Al-Alam Al-Arabi magazine, also a member of the Board of Trustees of China Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She obtained PhD from the Dan University in Shanghai. Dr. Mansour Hoyoshiang is the Dean of Peking University of International Studies and also editor of the Arab newsletter. He is very interested in the Middle Eastern and Arab studies. He has many achievements in this domain. He achieved or obtained his MA, and he is in the process of obtaining the PhD degree in the international study, and he speaks Arabic very fluently. And I give him the floor for 15 minutes. Thank you very much, honorable guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you very much for the presentation introduction. And I here would like to extend special thanks to the simultaneous interpreters, where I believe interpretation is very difficult. Here I would like to present the model of Silk Road and aspect of cooperation between China and GCC. Here I will address the strategy of the Silk Road and what is the pattern of cooperation between China and the GCC, and third, the main reasons for this pattern of cooperation. As you are aware, last year the leadership in China changed. The new president of China highlighted the Silk Road. This is not the official expression of the Chinese government. It is only common among the scholars and researchers. And I believe that the Silk Road represents the historical background of cooperation between China and GCC countries, chiefly the initiative by the president and the initiation of diplomatic efforts. The head of the Silk Road initiative, and also to institute a marine Silk Road to suit the 21st century. Also to stress the role of the Silk Road countries. Two major steps are initiated aiming at cementing bonds between the Silk Road countries in order to protect the shared interests, I mean between China and the countries located on both sides of the Silk Road. That's why the government has taken measures to reinvigorate the Silk Road. First, Chinese leaders carried out intense visits to all the countries located on both sides of the Silk Road, including those on the east and west. The second is to highlight the historical stories, recount these historical stories to reinvigorate the legacy of the Silk Road, as some may approve of and some disagree with the Silk Road philosophy, and to highlight the significance of cooperation for some shared interests. Third is to highlight the strategic significance of the Silk Road and the visits paid to foreign countries. It is usual the president, before his recent visit, published a large number of articles on both both social media and printed media in order to interpret the three Chinese principles of disclosure, transparency, and fourth measure was to take the human economic aspects of the Silk Road. For example, the Chinese government, once in place, it has introduced the principle of valid interest, to give preference to justice to interests, the principle of human solidarity and cooperation. Fifth is to put into implementation the Silk Road strategy in his recent address to the Central Treasury. This is a great step on the execution course, as this will pave the way for the initiative to establish the bank necessary for the cooperation. Second, to set up the Silk Road Fund, and also to put in place the inland and the marine Silk Road. It is noteworthy that the Chinese government pays attention to bilateral cooperation between China and Arab countries, namely the GCC, and I believe what are the forms of cooperation. I recommend to the Chinese government, to the Arab and GCC countries, to study or consider the 2+1, to take energy as the core of before anything else. Second is is to stress two aspects of combination, is to put attention to the infrastructure, also streamline economy and investment to cement the Arab-Chinese cooperation between the GCC and China, which should be reflected on the masses of the public. Third is to stress the technology cooperation, where the advanced technology should be put into attention. Nuclear power, renewable energy, as a tangible form of cooperation between China and the GCC. The Silk Road strategy provides new opportunities for cooperation, and both on the economic, human, and political levels, both at the level of the government and people, based on the spirit of the Silk Road. What is the Silk Road spirit? The mutual economic benefit, comprehensive human exchange, and sharing the goal of common interest and building on these interests. I would highlight the reasons behind this pattern of cooperation. The human and economic cooperation has proved to be the most successful experience of cooperation over thousands of years, as established under the Silk Road. This will represent a new force in cementing cooperation. If we go through the history of relations between China and the Arab states, over 2,000 years, the Silk Road was significant, as it was a point of converging viewpoints and rising above differences and translating or converting the differences into potentials. This is a point that is shared and agreed by both sides. In the past, trade and commerce between China and the Arab states through the three channels: religious, commercial, and scientific. Since the establishment of the Arab-Chinese Cooperation Forum, where China introduced 4 measures, including the 6-side meetings that reflects the regional and global efforts. In brief, China and the Arab states must expand horizons of economic cooperation and deepen human cooperation, and to combat some of the hot issues like terrorism, also maintain the Silk Road legacy. The diplomacy and cultural cooperation has become a vital medium to build up comprehensive cooperation. It will also act as a motivator to cement aspirations. I am not here to mention figures, but we must find the economic and commercial aspects of cooperations to be a springboard between China and the Silk Road countries. In addition to all this, China and the GCC has established a mechanism of consultation, economic and commercial, that has been in place in 1996. Also, discussions about building free zones or free trade zones. I'll give you an example: the strategic meeting between China and the GCC, and the Memorandum of Understanding signed on the strategic dialogue between China and the GCC countries. In comparison with the diplomatic cooperation, the economic and diplomatic cooperation on the human rights will reinforce the interest. For example, yesterday I paid a visit to the Islamic Museum of Arts in Doha. I did not see any of the Islamic Chinese antiques, despite the fact that the name of the museum suggests otherwise. I believe the Chinese Muslims have handcrafted a large number of antiques, and I hope this be included in the exhibits in the museum. Finally, the GCC countries have supremacy in terms of the soft power and energy. This will be a formidable force in terms of cooperation between the GCC countries and China. For example, the GCC countries have oil wealth. Also, they have a legacy of culture and traditions and interaction, positive interaction with foreign policies. For example, Qatar has won the right to express the Arab and Islamic affairs through Al Jazeera TV, and also Saudi Arabia has a certain form of attraction through the pilgrimage. In addition to all this, the GCC countries have other forms of supremacy, like having a common defense strategy and common security strategy. Also, the Arab Gulf Cooperation Council have dominance in terms of oil riches, and on the other hand, they are reinforcing economic and commercial interests that could be developed through the Silk Road strategy. To conclude, being natural partners through history, China and the GCC are partners, not only through history, through the Silk Road, but also the need to resurrect this spirit. And we are certain that this pattern, 1 plus 2 plus 3, of cooperation on the Silk Road between the GCC and China will pave the way for, or will turn a new chapter in history. Thank you very much for listening. Mr. Hoyoshiang, thank you very much for your presentation, where he compared the GCC-China relations. We had hoped, and many of you would raise questions about the figures, about the China GCC trade. Many are aware that Chinese were here even before the Portuguese, and Hormuz Strait and Qassam Island. The relations are deep rooted in history, and also the Silk Road goes bi-directional. The first one is the hydrocarbon and petrochemical. The second direction is the manufactured or products. Now we'll open the floor for questions, one from left and one from right. We have listened to a number of outstanding ideas. I have nothing to add, yet I would like to commend Dr. Abdullah al-Shayji for his outstanding or exceptional presentation. I have a question to him. You are aware that many of the citizens in this region are calling for the same development demands you raised. How can the Gulf communities or the research center bring this great idea into existence? My question is addressed to Dr. Bichara Khader. We are aware that Europe is concerned about two issues. First, the Arab unity. That's why Carbon Berman, early century, said there are peoples in the Middle East have all the potentials for unity and progress. Once they are united, they will pose a threat that will undermine the interest. That's why we should drive a wedge, and this was Israel. The second concern was that Europe do not wish to see the GCC opening up to the Arab Sea. That's why they are standing on the way of the unity. Do you believe that Europe still have the same concerns? Thank you for the wonderful presentations, the speakers. I have a small remark following up on Dr. Shayji, the fruitful presentation. It is the issue of the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the US and the big fear of a secret deal at the expense of the GCC countries, and also the secret meetings held in Oman. I would like to stress that the aim behind hosting this meeting in Oman was meant to steer the region away from any military confrontation. The issue of fossil fuels and the new trend among the United States towards East Asia. Mr. Stephen Hawke, نشكرك على ورقة العرض المفيدة، ولقد ذكرت عن تراجع السياسة الخارجية في منطقة الخليج على حد فهمي. هل تعتقد أن هذا تراجعا أم تغير في السياسة من إدارة بوش إلى إدارة أوباما إزاء القضايا في الشرق الأوسط؟ هل تصفه بالتراجع أو تغير؟ السيد منصور, you spoke about the Silk Road. It used to link Oman and the GCC to China 2,000 years ago. We see ships come anchoring in Sohar and Basra, and the first Arab navigator on the 8th century. This paved the way for further cooperation, not only in the cultural, we also have high hopes on the economic cooperation, and we hope that after the advent of the new president. I wish you to introduce yourselves before raising the question. Adnan Ayajna, professor of Qatar University.
Speak in English because my question is directed toward Stephen Hawke. If you want to take the plugs off and listen to my question. I think talking about the American decline, talking about the American decline is not a new thing. I think we have been studying this since the early 1980s of the last century. However, I found there is a correlation between talking about the American decline and the rise of the American involvement in the region. If you're talking about the decline, I think if you recall the book After Hegemony in 1984, there was also an involvement by the United States in so many wars as we are talking about the decline. And how do you explain if there is any correlation between talking about the American decline and a rise of involvement by the Americans in the region? However, there is no relation I found, I think from my hunch, even when the system was a bipolar system during the Cold War, the involvement of the United States really continued to be almost the same. Even when the unipolar moment rises after the end of the Cold War, the United States really continued to do that. Even after I think we listened to your results, and I have some questions about how you collected, I think, the results and how you measure, I think, international system. Also, the United States really continue to be involved in the region. And there is no indication that other rising powers, including China or Europe, where you sum them together, and I disagree because Europe does not have only one foreign policy. You sum the GDP, the military power together, and you come with the rising powers called Europe or India or China. But is there any indications that these powers are taking a role in the Middle East affairs? I will not dwell on the other measurements of power and how you measure powers in terms of economic power, because you get a multipolar system. But if you measure it as a military power, you get a unipolar system. If you measure it as what Dr. Abdullah al-Shayji would agree with me, as a soft power, you get a unipolar system. So the continuation of the system, I would like to see that connection. سؤالي للدكتور عبد الله الشيجي. طولت كثير، اختصر خلاص دكتور، خلاص شكرا. أسأل. طيب سؤالي للدكتور عبد الله الشيجي، ما رأيك في النظرية التي تقول أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تريد إعادة المنطقة إلى ما قبل عام 1979 وإعادة الدور الإيراني كشرطي للمنطقة الذي كان مقبولا من كل دول الخليج، حيث كان التحدي الأساسي لدول الخليج ليست إيران وإنما العراق؟ وشكرا جزيلا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ورقة صريحة جدا دكتور عبد الله.
Dr. Shayji, your paper is very straightforward.
هل استشيرت عمان عندما
Why was Oman consulted when many of the GCC countries decided to intervene in Libya and Syria and many other countries? Sometimes we judge matters from one perspective. Why do we ask the United States to stand by our side, despite the fact that they have a base in each and every Arab country, and they are moving their own weapons amongst us to fight here and there? People are absent from here, and the people cannot speak for themselves. And the big catastrophe is the research and studies centers. What centers are you speaking about? And most of them are led from abroad. Let's be honest, you and myself have taken part in many of the seminars. We are following the agendas that come to us from abroad, namely from the United States. As a matter of fact, despite all the rich and fruitful presentations, yet we are not honest enough. Thank you. Dr. Ibrahim Hadban, Al-Kuwait University. I have been listening to Dr. Shayji and Mr. Hawk, and came to me, I recalled a story. The status of the Gulf and its relation with the United States is very much reminiscent of 5 brothers who have a rapist, usurpant neighbor. The 5 sisters have 2 cousins, And the five sisters used to resort to the two cousins to give him a helping hand. Even the cousins have their own greeds, and the five sisters. That one of the sisters isolated herself from the other four and said, "You do what you wish." The four sisters tried to be beautiful enough for the superhero to attract the superhero to protect them from the bullying rapists. At the end of the story, the hero comes and he rapes everyone in the region. It seems that there is a consensus on the quality of Dr. Abdullah's presentation with all respect to the other speakers. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that the problem is domestic within the GCC countries. Before we put the blame on the United States or Iran, the true problem in the internal mechanisms and how we deal our issues. It seems that a uniform policy towards issues is absent towards Iran, towards Syria, towards Egypt, and a uniform policy towards Libya is also absent, and many to list. The living proof is that the situation among the GCC countries is weak, and three compelling issues have risen this year. For the first time, we speak about disbanding the GCC for an issue that is not concerning the countries themselves, yet an external. Yesterday, the second part is Dr. Omar spoke about the role of the GCC in Yemen. If the GCC, the initiative is Gulf, and however, fell at the hands of Iran, what would the situation be if the initiative had been Iranian? Another point to comment on the lady, I'm sorry not to mention her name. The stance taken by certain GCC towards Libya, Syria, or Yemen were exposed and or disclosed, and other countries may have taken part. The blame is that the negotiations that took between Oman, Iran, and the U.S. were secret, and that's why there was a negative impression regarding these discussions. The last to speak, the last questions from the left.
Ahmed Azim, جامعة بيرزيت, فلسطين. My question to Dr. Stephen Hawke. You built your presentation on the base that the international order regime is either unipolar or multipolar. But what about no polar system? It is the idea of Richard Haas, and that it is maybe the whole idea of polarity will finish now. And this will increase the importance of the non-state actors, including especially in the Middle East. And in this case, we have a new, completely a new game in the region. Thank you.
The last question, please. Yusuf Haddad, Georgetown University. Dr. Shayji, my question is, what are the incentives by the United States to support the GCC? In other words, let's be frank enough. In the United States, there is look at the GCC as exporters of terrorism by the Salafist and radical ideology. Two, oil. There is a war raging between the United States and the GCC countries on a market share. And this is clear in the recent OPEC decision to reduce productivity. Mr. Hawke, how or do you see the soft power as weak? Or are you, Bush, the greatest hawk, did not achieve anything when Russia invaded Georgia, but at least Obama has imposed sanctions on Russia after invading Ukraine, and now the economy is stagnant and suffering a lot. Why do you see the soft power as weak? Thank you very much.
لدينا 8 دقائق حقيقة.
We have 8 minutes
نبدأ بالدكتور عبد الله الشاشي.
to be shared equally, 2 each, 2 minutes each. Thank you for all those who raised questions to me, and most of them, and I'm not sure that 2 minutes will be sufficient. I will do my best to reply to the general theme. What is the importance and significance of the GCC, and how can the GCC countries develop themselves as one institution, and the secret discussions led by Oman? The GCC countries is a very active and effective player if they know how to use or take advantage of the cards. And as one of the people, one of you just mentioned that the council was about to be disbanded. All the countries must have a minimum amount of understanding and cooperation. That's why we are not blaming Oman simply for anything, but not to inform the GCC in a time where the United States itself was expressing that's reflected in the GCC US Strategic Forum, and to take the cooperation to higher level. And at the same time, turning a blind eye to the meddling by Iran, and at the same time engage in secret negotiations with them led by Oman. If the GCC had not had a seat on the GCC 5+1, we wouldn't have blamed Oman. Last year, at this time, Oman threw another bomb that it will not be part of the Union if this council moves into the Union, as it threatened to withdraw. This even before the crisis that happened recently, where the 3 GCC countries withdrew their ambassadors. We should be transparent, and how can we, as educated, cultured, as research and study center, and I don't agree with the question raised that we are being dictated to from the West. I have taken part in many of the research and study center in the GCC and overseas. I believe we have a ground to deal with. We have a common ground. We have great potentials, but we must put them to maximum use. Very important point, please. We did not punish Oman. Oman is not punished. It is part of the GCC region. Our policy toward this Syria and other countries. Oman was part. It took part in the GCC summits and the ministerial meeting, even if they did not sever relations or withdraw their ambassadors like what they did with Iraq under Saddam's regime. As I said, they're taking active part in the GCC meeting, summits, and ministerial meetings. Yes, the GCC countries have an internal problem. Let's agree on the priorities, goals, and challenges. Unfortunately, I do not see this agreement in place, especially in the face of the grave changes that we are living today, and in the face of the decline of the yes and the rise of others. The United States is willing to bring back Iran as a policeman of the Gulf. As I said, it is looking for a strong player who can deal with. Turning back to the Eisenhower policy, we wish to be influential active and instrumental player. We have proven to have strategic alliance with the United States on more than one occasion. At the end of the day, do not cost the United States a penny. We buy $80 billion of weapons, worth of weapons from Iran. And the sovereign funds reach $2.3 trillion. I believe these are very lucrative or attractive incentive.
You can by 2 minutes, please.
Okay, turn this on again. Thank you very much. 2 minutes. Thank you for the questions. I'd be glad to discuss these individually after the panel. First of all, just so you may remember, this is not, the idea that the U.S. is in decline is not new. This goes back a long way into the Cold War. I remember a book that came out in 1986 by Paul Kennedy, the historian. The title was The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. He talked about imperial overstretch, the demise of American hegemony. This is in the mid-1980s, late 1980s. And what happened soon after that was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And we saw that in Vietnam. We saw this is a recurring trend in our history. So this may well be another one of those periods where we have this projection of U.S. decline. But I think the difference now is that it's not so much in the ends or the goals, objectives of U.S. foreign policy. It's more of the means. Okay, the United States is somewhat more limited, and I think what we see now is changes in means rather than ends. Specifically, I heard the reference to Russia and the sanctions that seem to be biting. In terms of the Arab Spring and ISIS, you may be familiar with Obama's term, leading from behind, which means to rely more on intelligence, to rely more on high-tech weapons systems, to encourage the growth of civil society in these areas, to support regime change, training, and other things that the United States will be using these means rather than the boots on the ground. So that's something that's unique to this period. In terms of the, what is the balance of power? I think China is obviously perhaps the up-and-coming power, but I think there are several limitations to Chinese power, if I may say. One has to do with the industrial model. It's basically based on putting parts together, assembling, not so much research and development, patents, inventions, technological advances. The United States still leads in that category. And also the lack of allies in China's perimeter. In fact, China seems to be surrounded by countries that are somewhat skeptical of Chinese power and are actually looking to the United States for support and reassurance. So I think that may be of importance. Finally, the point about not a unipolar balance or a bipolar balance, but no polar, that would be sort of a multipolar model if there's no one pole or two poles. But let's remember that a unipolar world, for all of the problems that face the United States and all of the criticism of the United States, hegemonic stability has been successful in terms of creating a fairly stable international order post-World War II, in terms of the multilateralism, in terms of the UN, in terms of the sort of constitutional hegemonic balance in which the United States supporting and other countries supporting the rule of law, supporting civil society, limited government, and some other things that has brought some stability during the Cold War and post-Cold War. A bipolar balance is also, we saw in the Cold War, a bipolar balance That was somewhat stabilizing, as we know. Luckily, there was no World War III during the Cold War, that the power balance of bipolarity proved to be rather stable. So I think, in fact, a multipolar world would be more dangerous. It's unpredictable. But in the long term, I think history doesn't indicate that there's much precedent or many examples of a single power having domination for such a long time that there are limits to that kind of hegemonic power.
Thank you, Dr. Hook. Thank you. Dr. Bichara.
Based on the questions raised, I believe that the GCC policy is more important. The European policy is not of a concern. There is a concern that Europe is not a geopolitical player in the GCC simply for the reason that it doesn't have a uniform political stance and long-term strategy. And I believe this vision or this view is correct. Europe has worked towards fragmenting the Arab world in the past. That's true, and no one can deny this. Therefore, each superpower wishes to maximize its interest, and if they see the Arab unity as a threat, they work towards undermining this project. Like the Latin term divide to conquer. Historically, Europe did not work towards enabling the Arab countries to unite. Needless to say that the Arab unity in the 50s and 60s under the imperial systems were considered as threat to the European interests. The same applies to 1967 war, which was meant not only to end the Egyptian and Syrian armies, but also to put an end to the Arab nationalism agenda led by Abdullah. However, Europe believes that the absence of economical integrity among the countries is a threat to their interests, as the existence of fragmented, unstable countries will expedite the waves of illegal immigrations towards Europe, as these countries are unable to provide job opportunities to the educated young youth. Thank you for your questions. The Silk Road strategy introduced by the President is built on the ancient Chinese history. And if we analyze the strategy from three aspects, there are new terminologies like in the Chinese economy, like and how can we cope up with the developments. Second, and the cultural dimension of the Silk Road. To be honest, China faces shared problems with the Arab countries, including the religious radicalism, separatist ideologies, and many other challenges. We also analyze the strategy from a third dimension. I believe this strategy contains remedies to most, if not all, the problems in the coming period, at least in the coming decade. Thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers. Dr. Abdullah al-Shayji, Dr. Stephen Hock, and Dr. Bichara Khader. Professor Mansour Hoyoshiang, for their exciting, fruitful presentations that have enriched our conference. We'll take a break for coffee and adjourn for the third session. Thank you.